As Muslims, we know that Jesus Christ didn't die, and we accept it purely because the all-knowing Creator said so, regardless of the fact that historians believe he died. Here are our reasons. A. History is the weakest of sciences due to lacking empirical data, so therefore quote-unquote historical facts are the weakest of facts. Many times there have been things considered historical fact that no longer are, due to new evidence. B. Revelation over speculation of historians. This one doesn't need much more to be said. C. The Quran explains why it is considered that Jesus died, because it appears as if he did. So we can adequately explain why the Quran diverges from this supposed historical fact. D. There is sufficient evidence to demonstrate an uncrucified Christ. So they're the 4 reasons why we take the Quranic explanation over the historian speculation. Moving on, it's important to know that when going through this presentation, this is a historical exercise, so we will presume methodological naturalism. Only natural explanation are granted. Let's proceed. Here's an important question to consider. Was the historical Jesus Christ seen after his expected crucifixion date? If you say no, then it's hard to explain why all traditions purport an appearance of Christ after his expected crucifixion date. What we have from the Jesus movement, i.e. the disciples of Jesus, and from the later Pauline tradition, i.e. Paul and the proto-Orthodox Christians, both affirm an appearance of Christ after his expected crucifixion date. It's too prevalent to be a complete fabrication, this line of argumentation, that something is too much of a prevalent uncontested tradition to be absolutely made up, is used by biblical scholars to affirm the belief that Jesus was known as a miracle worker in his lifetime, so consistency demands that they do the same with this appearance after his expected crucifixion date.
Did the miracle-working materials arise during his lifetime? So people who believe in miracles would say yes. People who don't believe in miracles would be split. Most would say yes. Jesus had the reputation of being a miracle worker during his lifetime. And they have very, very strong arguments for that because it is so widely attested among our traditions that he was doing miracles that even if they weren't happening, it looks like everybody thought he was doing miracles.
So, we must affirm that he was believed to have been seen after his expected crucifixion date. Since this is a historical exercise, faith convictions that are out of touch with reality must be put to the side, since the evidence opposes some of these faith convictions, like the idea that the disciples worshipped Jesus or thought the law was abolished or thought he took away sin. These beliefs are later developments by Paul, not from Jesus. See my previous video for a more thorough breakdown of the falsification of these 3 claims about Jesus by the proto-Orthodox. So some of the historical considerations to bear in mind going forward. 1. The early followers of Jesus and his apostles did not consider Jesus divine. 2. Pauline Christianity is a later development that divinized Jesus and made him a sin sacrifice and made him abolish the law. These beliefs were not shared by the early followers. 3. The New Testament does not contain eyewitness testimony or fully accurate information, but rather, authentic and inauthentic material. This exercise attempts to take information from the Bible that is historically possible and make sense of it in light of other historical plausibilities. You may think it is cherry-picking, but this is what happens when you have useless fools who are more focused on telling stories and affirming biased theology than relaying authentic information. We have to be selective about what we accept. In other words, cherry-picking is required. Before beginning, let's assess some pushback that Dimas will give regarding our positions. 1. Since we're referring to the Ebionites as representing Jesus' religion with a degree of authenticity, Christian may contend, Ebionites reject virgin birth. You guys believe it, so they can't be Muslims. Our response? According to Origen of Alexandria, some sects of Ebionites didn't. But let's say that they all rejected virgin birth. You don't need to believe in the virgin birth to be a follower of Prophet Isa. They could have just perceived it to have been a fabricated belief by the proto-Orthodox, Pauline, Christians in order to legitimize his divinity. Both Luke and Matthew mention virgin birth in a context to make Jesus divine, so Ebionites threw it away along with divinity out of caution, not knowing that it was a true belief that was just hijacked by the proto-Orthodox. The point is that Isa's virgin birth isn't a required belief back then, just like the belief that he didn't die. These could have been matters lost and revealed exclusively by the Quran. Number 2. The Christian may contend, well, the disciples still believed Christ died according to scholars. You Muslims say he didn't, so Islam can't be true. The belief that Christ didn't die isn't required in order for them to be Muslims and followers of Christ. It was made to appear as though he died after all. So if they did think he died, that's to be expected. The fact he didn't die could be pure revelation, Quranic, while few, at the time, could have known. However, me personally, I'm of the opinion that the immediate disciples of Christ knew that he didn't die predominantly. This belief was just marginalized and undermined by the proto-Orthodox. They did so by marginalizing James, who was the main proponent propagating this belief, which will soon be demonstrated, and making him hardly known in history as the head of the church. People think it was Peter who was head of the church, who was more sympathetic to Paul's works initially, spending 15 days with him, visiting him in Galatia, etc. History and those recording it rewarded those in better standing with Paul. Historically, Peter was in better standing with Paul than James, so the Gospels gave the impression that he was head of the church. They suppressed the uncrucified Christ motif by exaggerating the crucifixion and divinity of Christ, almost as if combating an early community who denied his death and divinity, and by undermining the apostles when Paul says they're false apostles, so-called apostles, enemies of the cross. The Gospels also depict the disciples as stupid and unable to understand basic parables in order to delegitimize their authority, and so people look at them with incredulity. That's why none of the proto-Orthodox church fathers emerged from Jerusalem. They were not of the same tradition as the apostles, who were from Jerusalem, but were an offshoot evolved from their theology but with added, Pauline blasphemous, additions. Here's why it is historically plausible that the apostles believed Christ was uncrucified. Paul of Tarsus' subtext in his letter to Galatians 3 indicates that the men of James are denying Jesus Christ as crucified. It's the men of James because the whole of Galatians is a polemic against the Judaizers according to Christian commentaries. Said commentaries interpret the men of James present in Galatians 2 to be these Judaizers, along with those teaching another gospel mentioned in Galatians 1. You can see the commentary for Galatians 2 doing their best to divorce the men of James from James himself, but this is more of that Christian desperation to harmonize the early church with Paul. The very cause of this whole mess, bastardized harmonization. It's clear the men of James represent James due to them having their entire identity based on James, i.e. their names are men of James. Nevertheless, let's continue. And again in Galatians 3 regarding the ones who teach against Jesus being crucified, the same commentaries interpret it to be the Judaizing teachers once again, aka the men of James. The only reason why the men of James would go hundreds of miles from home, Jerusalem, to Galatia to deny Christ's death would be because their teacher James instructed them to. The only reason James would deny Jesus' death is if he had knowledge that Jesus didn't die, which could be via seeing Jesus after his expected crucifixion date. As a result, we can conclude that James did not believe Jesus died, and James is best suited to know about Jesus' whereabouts given that he is the head of the church and brother of Jesus. If he denies it, then it automatically becomes historically plausible that Jesus did not die, more so than the idea that he did die. These are my reasons for believing that the historical disciples deny that Jesus died, but their beliefs were subverted and suppressed by the proto-Orthodox. We don't have anything from the disciples according to historians and scholars. It's all either anonymous non-eyewitness accounts or Paul's accounts, who was neither an eyewitness nor holding the same beliefs as the disciples, so we can't reliably claim that they believed he died. Look at the variety in Christian belief. People are having fun with Jesus, trying to establish their philosophy, trying to make a name for themselves. So it is no surprise to find out that the one that turned out to be dominant is equally rooted in charlatanry and falsehood. And in reality Christ wasn't dead, it's historically plausible. Conclusions so far. The appearance of Christ after his expected crucifixion date truly took place based on the multiple attestation in all sources. The disciples and earliest Christians, Ebionites, didn't say Christ was divine or that he abolished the law or that he died for human sin. The disciples believed in an uncrucified Christ. So historically Jesus was seen after his expected crucifixion date. But how was he seen? Options. Alive and uncrucified, plausibly claimed by disciples, and historically legitimate. Option 2 is that he was seen after crucifixion via resurrection. proto-orthodox claim, but is historically illegitimate. Option 3. Mass visions of Christ, improbable and unclaimed, but historically legitimate. It is unlikely to be number 3, which is visions, because visions in and of themselves are implausible, but then multiple apostles seeing Christ is what makes it even more unlikely. Especially when people are denying Christ died, you're unlikely to do that due to a vision. And another reason is that the gospel depicts the appearance of Christ as in the flesh, that is plausibly authentic material in relation to Jesus. As for it being an apparitional resurrection appearance, only Paul depicts the appearance as apparitional. Despite Paul being earlier than the Gospel writers, he is an unreliable writer as demonstrated in the previous video. And it is not unreasonable to take the Gospels over Paul. The Gospels do contain historically authentic information, amidst the falsehood mind you, whereas Paul only states 4 or 5 historical facts about Jesus, namely he had 12 disciples, he had a last meal, he was crucified. This in the flesh appearance could well be another one of those pieces of authentic information that the Gospels contain. Other examples include the Q source material that the Gospels Matthew and Luke contain, which scholars consider authentic to Jesus, and the idea that Christ kept the law which is littered across the synoptic Gospels, etc. Furthermore, Paul constantly opposes the teachings of Jesus as we saw in the previous video, and he is more focused on quote-unquote winning people over than portraying the authentic Jesus. His goals are building a church, so will do what it takes to win people over. And what was it that he needed to do in order to win people in this case? It is to depict the appearance of Christ as apparitional and not corporeal, due to his target audience, i.e. Roman Gentile pagans, being more familiar with an apparitional motif.
Not flesh and blood, but immortal and glorious. So it reminds you of many of the Hellenistic accounts that we have, in which we have a person disappearing. I think Romulus is one of the best known. I think it's Ovid that talks about this in the passage I'm thinking of, where Romulus is giving a discourse to his Roman citizens in Rome on one of the hills, and he begins to rise up and then slowly disappear. And it says his body melts away as he rises. And so Paul apparently has something like that in mind for resurrection. That's in sharp contrast to what we have in the Gospels, where it is a flesh and blood body.
In light of this, it is more probable that the authentic rumor was an in-the-flesh appearance, which Paul distorted to an apparitional one in order to increase his persuasiveness. And much of the Jesus movement was consisted of Pharisees who followed the apostles. And the Pharisaic Jews already had resurrection ideas in their belief system, and this belief is prior to Jesus being on the scene too, so that was helpful for Paul. So we will continue with the belief that the Gospels in the flesh appearance rumor is authentic. You may be thinking that the Gospels don't just depict an in the flesh appearance, but they, like Paul, depict a resurrected appearance. But given that this is a historical exercise, supernatural claims are not granted. So when we peel away the supernatural, what do we have? We have the idea of a resurrected appearance of a man in the flesh, becoming the idea of an appearance of a man in the flesh. No resurrection. And this is likely to be the kernel of truth and the original layer of the rumor which was later transformed into resurrection. We will soon get to how. But as Muslims, we do in fact believe in the supernatural, so it may seem underhanded for me to appeal to naturalism. That's fair, so hear this. Another reason we don't need to accept the specific supernatural in this case is because of the unreliable origin of the supernatural claim. We Muslims don't just accept any supernatural claims, only those from reliable authorities like Prophet Muhammad or his companions. But in this case, the earliest claimant of this supernatural claim is Paul of Tarsus. A deceiver as we saw in the previous video, and a false prophesier. I don't take supernatural claims from liars. As a result, the resurrection rumor is rejected. Furthermore, the apostles believe Christ was uncrucified, therefore meaning he couldn't have resurrected. Because if you have not died, then you can't resurrect. So again, we Muslims have no reason to accept the supernatural claim when a greater authority on this matter of Jesus didn't accept the supernatural claim. What are the steps we took to reach this conclusion? A. There was a real appearance of Christ after his expected crucifixion. B. The appearance was not a visionary, apparitional one but a real in the flesh one. C. An in the flesh appearance cannot be as a result of resurrection due to methodological naturalism rejecting supernatural propositions, meaning that the in the flesh appearance could only be due to him being uncrucified. We need not accept the supernatural resurrection due to it contradicting a more reliable source, and the claimant of the resurrection being a lying deceptive charlatan and false prophesier. So, where did the idea that Jesus died come from? It came from actual belief that he died, among followers and enemies alike. Why? Because the Romans thought that they killed him and publicized this belief. Why did they confidently think they killed him? Because of Judas' deception. It is plausible that Judas did not in fact betray Jesus but misled the Romans, who did not know what Jesus looked like, when they came asking for Jesus Christ. Judas could have easily identified an impostor, someone like Jesus Barabbas who has almost identical traits as Christ in this situation according to the Gospels, both accused of insurrection, both Jewish men, both have the name Jesus, both to be killed on Passover, both acquired the title Son of the Father aka Barabbas. Christ could have escaped and Barabbas taken as Christ. The narrative of Barabbas being released is implausible due to it being unhistorical. A murderer would not be released. It's more plausible that this release narrative is an artificial retrospective typology fabricated by the desperate gospel authors, to match the New Testament with the Old Testament and give the impression of continuity. Where one animal is sacrificed for God and the other is the scapegoat, released to the wilderness. In the typology Jesus is the sacrifice for God and Barabbas is the scapegoat. But in reality it's a retrospective literary technique by a conscious deceptive author. It's similar to when the Gospels try to sculpt Jesus around the Old Testament to make a prophecy. For instance, the Gospel of John depicting Jesus as being pierced on the crucifix in order to mirror the Old Testament Isaiah 53. But what gives it away is that John is the last Gospel. No Gospel before it comes with that detail. Which shows that this is John's novel way of tying Jesus back to the Old Testament. And that's how Christ was contaminated with the title Son of the Father, which was originally Barabbas. Also check out the hilariously pathetic level of scrutiny we're dealing with. This lunatic author of John thinks that this is something convincing, quote, "He who saw it has testified, and his testimony is true, he knows that he's telling the truth." So John alleges someone saw it, and gives no reference for who it was. Then he speaks on behalf of his source by claiming that he speaks the truth and knows he's telling the truth. Broken chain of transmission like usual. The author is lying or uncertain and compensates for it with grand speech. May Allah curse them. The ultimate nail in the coffin for the idea that Pilate released Barabbas is that historically Pontius Pilate was known for being callous and inflexible, so the release of a prisoner, much less a murderer, becomes even more fictional. Now let's put it all together. Due to this mix-up, people thought Jesus died for a few days. Jesus eventually visits his apostles after his expected crucifixion date. We see the kernel of truth of this from the Gospels in the form of post-resurrection appearances to apostles. The reality is that there was no resurrection because he didn't die, and the appearance was a normal in the flesh one, which was retrospectively turned into a resurrection motif. Why? Because the apostles would have reported that they saw Jesus and that he didn't die, but their followers, i.e. the Pharisees, would be perplexed since the Romans, who are their authority, reported Christ as dying, so the saying of the Romans superseded the saying of the apostles due to the common people's inferiority complex and respect of authority. They were confused. How could Jesus be seen after dying? The natural conclusion for a Pharisee? He resurrected. This is because Jesus was known in his life for doing resurrection acts historically, so the idea of resurrection is already related to Jesus. Furthermore, the people saying Jesus died and resurrected are Pharisees, people who already had a belief in resurrection before Jesus. So it's confirmation bias, that is the birth of the resurrection motif. The reason I'm identifying a source to the resurrection motif that's earlier than Paul, despite Paul being the earliest historical source that refers to it, is because scholars consider it to be the case that the resurrection preceded Paul. So it must have been from someone between the apostles and Paul. And the early resurrection belief is a non-divine resurrected Jesus. Where did the idea that Jesus was divine come from? A charlatan named Paul of Tarsus, who is the earliest person in history to divinize Jesus. Scholars agree that the apostles did not consider Jesus divine, so this divine dying rising Jesus would not be their handiwork, and it's implausible their students would. It's more probable that a heretic like Paul, who was theologically opposed to the apostles, is the father of this bastardized tradition. The idea that Jesus died was popular, so was the belief that he was divine and abolished the law. But guess what? The latter two beliefs are rejected as inauthentic, unoriginal beliefs by biblical scholars. Earliest followers of Jesus kept the law and did not consider Jesus divine. So if the latter two popular beliefs can be false, so too can the popular belief that he died. It is perfectly within the realm of possibility. And what makes it historically plausible that he didn't die but escaped, is the fact that Ignatius records that there are a group of Christians who deny Christ's death in the 1st century. On top of the fact that the earliest believed sources, Q source, have no narratives about Jesus dying or being divine, their failure to mention it lends credibility to the idea that such beliefs are inauthentic to the original followers of Jesus but are later developments. Then you have commentaries affirming that there are possibly apostles denying the crucifixion of Christ, separate from James, so it only corroborates James doing so. So even if you reject my speculated explanation as to how Jesus escaped, i.e. Judas deceiving Romans, we know that somehow the historical Jesus lived to see his apostles after the expected crucifixion date. For visual learners, see conclusion here. This conclusion best explains the data we have, and demonstrates a historically plausible uncrucified Christ, thus vindicating the Quran and showing its intimate knowledge, by it harmonizing the superficial appearance of Christ's death with the esoteric reality of his life. And those that the Christians appeal to support historicity of crucifixion are Tacitus and Josephus, because they are 1st century non-Christians. But these people are less authoritative than the apostles, who seem to deny crucifixion, so it is already of a weaker caliber. Not only that, but when they refer to Jesus' crucifixion, they don't specify that they are reporting from any documents or Roman annals. That is an undue presumption from apologetic Christians. It is much more sensible to presume that they are reporting axiomatically that he died, due to the prevalence of the claim that he died caused by the proto-Orthodox, during the times of Tacitus and Josephus. This is affirmed by biblical scholars as well. So Tacitus and Josephus are not independent sources attesting to the crucifixion, but are conduits for the same source, namely proto-Orthodoxy. Even if we presume that Tacitus and Josephus did refer to the Roman annals to derive the idea that Jesus died, that would not be unexpected either, given that it appeared as if he did die, according to the Quran. As usual, evidence is in the description.